Oh boy. So, today's Ancient DOS game is Star Wars Rebel Assault 2: The Hidden Empire. Now, back when I covered the first travesty of a game, I mentioned that the sequel was way better than the original, though I wasn't 100% certain on this, for a couple of reasons. Mostly the fact that I only ever played the demo version, and that was way back as a kid. But I recalled the demo version playing perfectly fine, so figured this sequel would probably be fine too. Well, not quite. So here's the thing. The main issue the first Rebel Assault game had was that its controls were just utter garbage. The mouse controls had auto-centering, which you were constantly fighting against. The joystick controls were extremely sensitive on the Y-axis. Either one you picked, the controls were buffered and could end up creating inputs for up to a full second after you're done moving them around, and there was no keyboard support whatsoever. Here in Rebel Assault 2, the controls are better. Not perfect, as we're going to get into them a little later on, but better. The main takeaway is that, so long as you play with a joystick or mouse, you can indeed control most parts of the game as expected now. And they technically did add keyboard support, but it's a joke. Don't even attempt to play the game that way. The main issue this time around is actually entirely different, and we're going to tackle it last, as I tend to do, but as you watch the gameplay unfold, as I describe how everything works, you might be able to figure it out on your own.
One to the right.
I copy. I'm in position. Here they come.
Star Wars Rebel Assault 2 was yet again developed and published by LucasArts, this time in 1995, and once again is best described as a one-player rail shooter. It supports VGA 320x200 and SVGA 640x400 graphics, both with 256 colors. Though if the 640x400 mode fails to initialize, it'll fall back to a more traditional 640x480 mode and simply letterbox the 640x400 rendering. At least, according to the manual. I couldn't find any command line options to test this functionality, which is kind of an oversight because depending on the user's hardware, 640x400 could be supported by the graphics card, but not the CRT monitor, in which case you'd be screwed. As for audio, since it's all digitized, all the supported sound devices are ones which can produce digitized sound effects. As for its current release date, it's still commercial and easily obtained as a digital download from the Good Old Games website at www.gog.com as a package of the first 2 Rebel Assault games for $10. The physical copies are also fairly easy to come across, going for just a few bucks as a jewel case or around $20 to $25 fully boxed. However, if you want a specific physical copy of the game, that's where things can get a little confusing. Firstly, the PlayStation version of this game is far easier to come across, even though the PC version isn't rare either. For every PC copy, you'll probably run into about a dozen PlayStation copies, keeping in mind you're going to find hundreds for sale when you go searching. However, when you do find a PC copy, and it happens to be fully boxed, now you have to consider if it's the DOS version or the Mac version, and then you still have to consider if it comes with the original game as a bonus or not, as not all boxed copies do. Secondly, there's a misconception about there being a native Windows port of the game. Now, this is because the DOS version actually allows for fine-tuning a special multimedia timer in order to function better while being run under Windows, but it's still only a DOS game. The difference between the Mac and DOS versions is also easy to spot, since the Mac version has a sticker plastered on the front of the box indicating as such, which is absent entirely from the DOS version. Thirdly, in terms of determining if you're getting the bonus of the first Rebel Assault game in the box or not, it'll actually say as such on the box. However, there's no consistent way this is done, and I wasn't able to figure out if some of these methods were printed on the box itself, or stickers found on the shrink wrap for a sealed copy. Now, if you see the box say that you're getting the original game as a bonus, then you are. But if you don't see such a sticker, you may still get the original game. But it's no longer guaranteed, and I couldn't find a reliable way to determine this. And lastly, that's one thing I noticed is that the price of sealed copies is kind of ridiculous right now, even though again, they're not even remotely rare, with the cheapest sealed copy I ran across being listed for $120. But actual sale prices for sealed copies are more like $60. So yeah, do your homework and don't spend triple digits on a sealed copy. It's not worth that much.
The rebel fighters are in range, my lord. Sigma Squadron stands ready, awaiting your command.
Very well, Admiral. Engage the rebels.
I'm gonna skip on giving a rundown of the story because it's actually incredibly simple. With this game following the events of the first game, except this time around, Rookie 1 as he's called, ends up caught right in the middle of uncovering a plot by Darth Vader and the Galactic Empire to produce a massive fleet of small fighters completely invisible to eyes and sensors until they attack. Though I suppose one major difference is that now there's actual actors and acting going on with full motion video clips, instead of weirdly animated pieces of actors, so at least there's that. Before you start playing through, you need to create a pilot and set your difficulty from one of 6 selections: Beginner, Novice, Standard, Expert, Custom 1, and Custom 2. Yeah, one of the main selling points of the game is that you have complete control over numerous internal values which affect the overall difficulty of the experience. The game's built-in interactive manual system also tells you exactly how this works, so you can easily create custom difficulty levels and tweak them however you want. Now, some players may be like, oh, so you mean I can cheat and just set all the damage values to 0 and just not even play the game? And yes, you can. In fact, I intentionally set up my Custom 1 difficulty to work like that for investigation purposes. But it's hard to call it cheating when the devs intentionally made it possible to do this. Though given how absurdly difficult the original game was because of its issues, I can understand why this feature even exists at all. I'll go over the differences in the pre-built difficulty settings a little later. The gameplay itself is split across 15 missions, with a couple missions having checkpoints halfway through due to changing gameplay styles mid-mission. But essentially, all of the missions conform to one of 4 styles of gameplay: first person in cockpit shooting and dodging, third person shooting and dodging, third person on foot shooting and taking cover, and a single first person on foot shooting section. Now each method of gameplay feels wildly different from each other, so let's go over the specifics. Most of the game focuses on first person flight and attack. It's a good thing these sections make up the bulk of the game because, quite frankly, they also play the best out of all of them. Now, enemies will come into view and you have to lock onto them and shoot them. While in some sections you'll also need to dodge obstacles by moving your mouse cursor around, as this shifts your position slightly. Now if you're using mouse for control, you simply point and click, as you would expect to be able to do. There's no insipid auto-centering here. And if you're using a joystick, the position of the joystick directly translates to the position of the cursor and is no longer affected by an overly sensitive y-axis. If you're using a keyboard, you slowly drag a crosshair across the screen. Yeah, I wasn't kidding when I said the keyboard controls were a joke. However, I was finally able to get an answer to a question I had about the first game now that I've played this one. What the heck does a target lock do? In the first game, you would often see the word lock flash on screen, which didn't really seem to mean much of anything, just that the cursor was directly over top of a target. And yeah, that's technically what it means, but it also means that if you fire your weapons while the lock is active, no matter where everything moves following, your weapons will hit that target, guaranteed. Without a lock, you can still hit things, but since it takes a split second for your shots to reach their mark, you're more liable to miss as your shots won't track the enemy's on-screen position if they're not locked. All of the pre-made difficulty levels have locking enabled on every level, but you can disable it if you so desire, and this really ups the challenge quite a bit. Also, I feel I should point out there's no multi-hit targets anymore. All targets go down in one shot now, which is kinda weird, but I get it. Next up we have the third person on foot sections. There's only a couple of these in the game, and during them you basically duck behind cover while enemies are shooting. Then when you've got an opening, you get out of cover and take out the enemies as they pop up. These sections are kind of a throwaway as they're not really all that tricky on most of the difficulty settings. Next up is the third person flight mechanics. This was really bad in the original game, and here, it's not much better. The one plus side is that the controls are not hampered by the issues the first game had, but they are still extraordinarily sensitive, and you still get whipped around, along with the controls being accelerative instead of direct, meaning you push the mouse slightly left to accelerate yourself towards left movement until you counter with right movement. And yes, even the joystick and keyboard controls work the same way, adding acceleration instead of being direct. It is far too easy to lose control in these sections because of this. But once you have the levels memorized, because the controls are consistent now, it is definitely possible to make it through them if you don't lose control. In other words, practice makes perfect. Though this is probably a good time to bring up that there's an option to flip the Y-axis for your controls, which are already flipped by default, so setting them to be quote-unquote flipped will make up go up and down go down. Yeah. And further complicated by the fact that this is dependent on the level, as some levels treat things flipped by default and some don't. But there's no option to change this on a per level basis. Thus, if you play the first mission and set your Y-axis to flipped, well sure, up will be up and down will be down. But then you'll get to the second mission with third person on foot shooting and suddenly up will be down and down will be up. Unfortunately, you can bring up the options menu mid-mission by pressing the O key on the keyboard, but for crying out loud, they should have just made it possible to adjust which Y-axis flipping you want for each mission type instead of changing it automatically based on a global option. The only other style of gameplay is a first-person on-foot section, which only happens once, and this section is just plain weird, because the entire thing is done with computer-generated visuals, even though the rest of the game is done with live action, using computer-generated visuals only for death sequences or anything that doesn't directly involve actors. Not to mention, this entire sequence takes place using a night vision thing. It's short and weird, and I'm just gonna leave it at that. So, now I can go over what the changes in difficulty actually do. Essentially, each difficulty setting changes how many points you get per second, how many points targets are worth to shoot down, how much damage you take from different kinds of obstacles, how quickly enemies are able to attack you, and for the third-person flight sections, how much drift is imparted on your ship during camera slides and turning and such. Generally speaking, you take about twice as much damage on Expert compared to Beginner, and get 4 times as many points, though it also takes 4 times as many points to get an extra life. Beginner also shows special arrows to point out roughly where the safe zones are so that you can avoid obstacles, but for third-person flight specifically, I've actually found it more reliable to just go by instinct, since oftentimes the arrows are pointing out spots which will damage you if you get too close, since you're often in a narrow corridor. So for third-person flight, it's often better to just ignore the arrows. Novice replaces the arrows with a 4-way arrow symbol, which simply signifies if an obstacle is on approach or not. Standard doesn't show any collisions avoidance arrows at all, while Expert goes one step further and also removes the green target indicators, making it tricky to know what you can shoot and what you can't in some circumstances. I should also point out that custom difficulties always set the extra life awards the same as standard difficulty, every 15,000 points. The last thing to mention before we get on to the main failing of the game is that there's not a lot of variety here. Even the first game had a split path right in the first level, but here there's really not a lot of that going on, nor is it possible to fail missions anymore. For instance, when taking out a reactor core, if you don't shoot any of the cooling vents, you still somehow take it out? Or if someone you're supposed to protect takes damage because you didn't shoot out a pursuer fast enough, you simply take a lot of damage yourself, seemingly out of nowhere.
Rookie-1, is that you?
I don't believe I've ever had to critique a game before for having a lousy presentation, but here we are. Rebel Assault 2's presentation feels like nobody cared, which is ironic because, at least on the filmography side of things, there was a lot of passion going into this, but there's so many little disjointed aspects it makes it feel like either this was rushed out the door or no one bothered to ensure the little things were rectified, because there's a ton of little things going wrong here. For starters, I want to elaborate on the story just a little bit more in that it feels like low-quality fan fiction. The writing makes blatant callouts to the Star Wars movies for absolutely no reason other than to just do it. The story itself feels contrived, it has this thing for unnecessarily killing people off, and the entire story is just 100% pointless given how it ends. Which, I mean, I get why they would make it like that so as not to taint the Star Wars canon, but as mentioned in my coverage of the first game, they didn't seem to have a problem with starting things in the events of New Hope, jumping to Empire Strikes Back, and then going back to New Hope and completely screwing with the timeline in the process. But really, there's just so much about this which just feels, well, dumb. I mean, there's no other way to put it. For instance, right now, you're watching the very first mission. You can see my wingman in the B-wing out in front. And watch carefully now. Yeah, he just fired a single round of lasers at nothing. Even if I didn't shoot down the enemies, this wouldn't have changed anything. He still would have fired a single volley of lasers, aimed at nothing, shooting nothing down in the process. And he does this multiple times over the course of this level. This isn't the only level where stuff like this happens either. You frequently hear banter and comments from the other members of your squadron which just don't line up to anything happening on screen. Or when stuff does happen on screen, it's just them making a flyby, claiming an enemy is on them, or that they're trailing an enemy, but all you see is their ship and no other enemy ship trailing or being trailed. And I can't even count the number of times a wingman shouts, "Pull up," when the obstacle you need to dodge is above you. Continuing with the trend of things not being properly tested, normally when you play the third-person on-foot sections, you only see your mouse cursor when you come out of hiding. I kind of wish they would show the cursor at all times, especially since there's one particular moment at the end of the first section like this, where you have to decide whether to come out of hiding to the left or right, which is based on the cursor position. But since you can't see your cursor, it's not easy to intentionally get yourself set to go the way you want to. But if you put the game on expert skill or turn off the green highlights to indicate targets, guess what disappears from the third-person on-foot sections? The mouse cursor. As in, entirely. How the heck are you supposed to do third-person aiming without a cursor? This makes playing these sections on expert borderline impossible. At least until I discovered that these are entirely based on the number of enemies defeated, and then it will just refill empty enemy spots when there's still enemies left to fill them. So all you have to do is dial in one spot, hide until you have a good moment to attack that spot, and repeat until no more enemies show up there, and then finally get rid of the remaining enemies. I don't know how you would ever pull this off with the joystick. Actually, let's talk about the mouse cursor some more, because it runs at the same frame rate as the gameplay, only 15 frames per second. There's a reason why mice have updated at 125 Hz since USB became a thing, and it's because it's way easier to track and move a mouse cursor at a high frame rate compared to a low one. If they decoupled the mouse cursor from the active rendering of the scene being played back, it would have been way easier to play this thing, at least in terms of aiming. Though speaking of the frame rate, you can adjust that. The advanced control options allow you to change the frame rate between 10 and 20 FPS, with 15 being the frame rate the game was designed to play at. Neat idea in theory, as this effectively allows you to control how fast the game plays, as you can see. There's just one tiny little problem with this. It also affects the cutscenes. Considering these cutscenes are fully voiced and they don't change the vocal rates for obvious reasons, making the cutscenes run at your selected frame rate is just bizarre. There's a ton of other things I don't really have much to say about either. For instance, if you take out a required target which can injure you, but its destruction animation doesn't finish playing out until the point where it would injure you, it still will. And this includes targets you're trying to defend, such as during the speeder bike sequence. Or how it is that a comically large number of stormtroopers are hiding behind the corners of this tiny elevator. Or how the high scores are not separated by skill and populate the same table. Or that you can actually earn higher scores by doing worse, since then you're getting to replay sections and score off of them more. Or that you get skill-specific passwords for each stage that you'll never use because it's auto-saving your progress. Or that audio quality is abysmally poor with one exception, the 6th mission where you take out a mining operation, which just coincidentally happens to be the one and only mission included with the demo version of the game. And you still hear a laser sound every time you take a hit, no matter what it is that hits you. Okay, let me level with you all for a moment. Overall, Star Wars Rebel Assault 2 is way better than the original game as far as raw gameplay is concerned. It's just everything else which suffered this time around. I would rather play this game over the first Rebel Assault any day, but the first one actually felt like it had stronger direction and a stronger presentation despite its issues, whereas this game just feels like a bunch of disjointed missions which are all fairly similar to each other, and when it does mix things up with speeder bikes or night vision, it just feels off. I mean, it's difficult to recommend this one, but at the same time, despite its issues, it's still playable, and that's more than can be said about the original. The game works fine with the auto cycle setting, but will occasionally give you little hiccups, so setting a high fixed cycles rate will help clear that up. I recommend a setting of about 80,000. Also, if you intend to use a joystick, I actually recommend turning on DOSBox's joystick auto-fire setting for this one, as the game technically has its own auto-fire built in, but the built-in auto-fire rate is an even bigger joke than the keyboard controls. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, a couple Saturdays from now, will be an ADG Pro video, where we're going to be investigating the mechanics of a particular game, which often has its mechanics ignored due to the sheer depth of them, just to see if we can manipulate them to our own ends and figure out a few tricks in the process. So be sure to tune in on Saturday, January 29th to check out what I've got lined up. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small selection of you guys.
Good shooting, team. Okay, let's go home.